U.S. escalates tech battle by cutting China off from AI chips. This is how the tech wars began. Yes, they were always in full swing. Yes, there was always competition. But the tech wars in earnest began with the embargo against China as it relates to technology or chips, semiconductors that would be used for artificial intelligence, used for nuclear systems, used for the improvement of China's economy overall, as well as making it more productive. And so, with the creation of the tech wars, it is now expanding. The EU just got a step closer to hitting Chinese EVs with additional tariffs and may even apply them retroactively. This is an alarming occurrence. This escalation of, I always say to myself, in Monopoly, you don't cheat when you're winning. In Monopoly, you begin to cheat when you're losing. And something's going on in the technology sectors in the West where the governments in the West are finding it increasingly necessary that they should cheat, that they should rig the system to try to contain China, to try to prevent them from outpacing them, instead of ramping up technology, instead of doing a moon landing moment. What we see is more movement towards protectionism, more movement away from innovation, thinking that that will stop the tide. And I want to give you 5 reasons the West can't cripple China's tech sector. The West cannot stop the technological advancement that is moving forward in China and indeed in other parts of the world. This notion that you can hamper a country as large as China, a country with the resources and with the manufacturing capabilities, that never has worked in the past. All it has done is created negative externalities, unintended consequences, and ultimately it has backfired on the collective West. It has backfired on this G7 countries. It's backfired on the Davos crowd. This notion that instead of playing the game fairly, that you can cheat, and somehow in cheating, that's going to hold your adversaries back long enough that you can propel yourself forward. U.S. chip export ban is great news, says partner at Chinese tech investment fund. I read this article and it may be that you're confused by the title. The partner at the Chinese tech investment fund is saying that this is great news for China, not great news for us. These export bans are enabling them to artificially create markets and market share where there was none. When you ban chips or you ban a product from the market, we see this in Ukraine and in the Russia conflict. When these things were banned from the market, all it did was hurt American companies because it prevented them from entering these markets. It prevented them from gaining the type of market share or maintaining their market share, as well as gaining market share. It created avenues for local investment in these sectors that were just created as a result of the sanctions regime. And so the same thing is happening right now in China. When we do export bans, that creates opportunity for investment, that creates markets that really should not exist. But we have enabled them to create those markets, create those spaces where inferior products could be sold, where if there was a open capitalist system, an open system where the freedom of goods and services were flowing, those companies would not have the opportunity to gain market share with inferior products. China wants to rid itself of Western tech by 2027, outlines domestic alternatives. That's crazy to think that they could decouple themselves technologically, but it's actually not so crazy when you think of the export bans, when you think of the tariffs, when you think of the reviews, when you hear all of these, this protectionism. I look at the TikTok debate that's going on right now, and this protectionism won't solve the underlying problem of innovation. Innovation efficiency, innovations in technology, innovations in manufacturing. That should be the way that the West is going, not only to have a competitive advantage, but provide the types of jobs, the high paying jobs that our economies in the West will need to go into the future. But instead, what we see is protectionism. Instead, what we see is an attempt to rig the game. Instead, what we see is an attempt to go backwards away from international order, from international rules, from open markets, and to go take the world back into a time where protectionism was the name of the game. Let's look at the China Semiconductor. This is the first reason why I don't believe you can withhold technology and get the type of decline in the tech sector, the slowing down in China. China's AI industry barely slowed by U.S. chip export rules. The reason that the export ban really didn't work is in large part because we are in an interconnected world. We're in a world where, yes, you may prevent me from getting things from one source, but those things can come through many other sources. The interconnected nature of our economies, we're seeing this in Russia now, where Russian missiles and Russian drones are being found in the battlefield of Ukraine with U.S. companies and others' technology built in. And you say, how can this be? Well, this is an interconnected economy, the global economy. You sell things to one country, to one company. That company does business with another company. And ultimately, over the many transactions, it ends up in the place that was banned. And so the emergence of this new sanctions regime, the heavy dependence, has created this moment where countries across the world are finding ways to get around these export bans and these sanctions. They're finding ways to evade and still get the goods and services and the products from the West, the technological products from the West that they need. And so these export bans really didn't accomplish much. To look at it, look at this. U.S. microchip export controls imposed last year to freeze China's development of supercomputers used to develop nuclear weapons and artificial intelligence. Seeing systems like ChatGPT are having only minimal effects on China's tech sector. So 1 year after the export controls were put into place, it was known that they were not successful. So the question is, if those, it's the definition of insanity. I don't know what our leaders are doing or what they're thinking, but it seems like when something doesn't work, they don't go back and say, why didn't this work? Is there a better way to accomplish our goals? What it seems like they consistently do is let us double down on our failure. The same thing is happening with the Russian sanctions. Go back and watch the video I did about why Russian sanctions are failing. If the sanctions are failing, and it has become clear that because of the overuse of sanctions, countries are finding ways to evade these sanctions. Why do more? Why not figure out another strategy, another path forward, instead of doing sanctions that in the end hurt the very country, the very thing? They did this export ban, and then it was all over the news. Not a year or so later, Huawei used U.S. tech to make advanced chips. Not only are they able to produce the advanced chips, and the chips appeared in cellular devices, but they used United States technology in order to create the advanced chips. So this whole notion that we're going to cripple the tech sector in China by doing these embargoes, by putting these measures in place, by sanctioning companies, and it's just not worked. And I don't know where you can really show where against a large economy these types of measures have worked. It's one thing to do it against a small economy, a third world nation, a nation without industry, a nation without natural resources, a nation without partners that is already isolated. But to try to win the tech war by embargo, by tariff, against a nation like China in today's global economy seems to me to be far-fetched and misguided. China and Japan gave TSMC over 1.5 billion in subsidies to build and equip new fabs as U.S. CHIPS Act payouts stall. So essentially, what's going on is China is filling the void in investment in the chip making space. They're filling the void. They're working now consistently to provide money for the sector inside of China and with their partners. They're working so that they can have the type of situation to where by 2027, they can thumb their nose at the West, they can thumb their nose at the United States and say there's no stopping us. We've decoupled, and in decoupling, we've crippled your chip making companies that had tremendous market share, were tremendously profitable. We've decoupled them, and as a result, now we've got companies or competitors to the world. Essentially, all this embargo has done is enable China to create an artificial market for chips, to develop those chips, and now to become a competitor to American companies. China to give chip makers $27 billion to counter U.S. sanctions. They're creating funds and pouring money into this sector in an attempt to bring it up to speed, and they will, because the market is artificially created. And ultimately, what's going to happen is we will find over the next years that we've created a competitor where a competitor did not exist. We've created a situation where there are others out there providing equal or greater products in a sector that once was dominated by the United States and the West and the G7 nations. But because of their unwillingness to play the game fair and to allow natural development in the flow of goods and services, trying to rig the game, they created a competition that I don't know over the long run who will win such a war. Because when we look at the tech sector across the board, look what Huawei was able to do, and look at the time frame in which they were able to do it. Yes, the technology was stolen. Yes, they used parts. Yes, they evaded sanctions. But what the real issue becomes is the progress they've made over such a short period of time. Now, in the tech or in the chip making sector, China is behind. But when it comes to industrial robots, China far outpaces the United States. And I think that's the issue, that in each of these tech sectors, there are countries that excel. But the key is, what is the nature of the progress that they are making across the board in all of these sectors? And when you look at China, China is making at breakneck speed, has had an acceleration in their capacity to make chips. But also, China has already and is the leader in industrial robots. China using industrial robots at 12 times U.S. rate. We talk about winning the tech war. The tech war is not just about the brains that fuel factories and technology. It's also about the machines of the future. And when it comes to the machines of the future, China is really doing, we often see the cute little robots at the trade shows and displays, running upstairs and doing backward flips, and it's more consumer products. And it looks funny to us. We see these helpers, and maybe they're cooking hamburgers or they're doing some other thing. Yes, it's robotics, but we don't see it as a threat. Well, the reality is the robots that are the biggest threat are the rise of industrial robots. That's robots operating in factories, whole factories where there's no lights in the factory. The factory works in the dark because the only time they need to turn on the lights is when a technician goes in, where the products are flowing and the machines are working, backed by AI, backed by individuals off-site or in remote sites who are monitoring the productivity. That's the real threat. Almost half of industrial robots are in China. Half of the world's industrial robots in 2022 were in China. And that advantage has only been expanded and continues to grow. And that's alarming. These industrial robots will be the factories. We talk about the industrial base of the West. The industrial base of the country declined. in the United States and Britain, this deindustrialization, well, it's going to be hard to emerge and to rebuild your industrial sector when the opposition is using robots to sustain and grow. You're not only going to have to make significant investment, but you're going to have to train the workforce and the skill sets in order to create the type of industrial factories that will be needed in the future. It won't be a going back to the past. It will be a trying to leap forward to a new vision of what industrial production looks like. And China has already staked their claim. Industrial robot density in China is rising, as rising labor costs and demographic changes fuel the rapid adoption of technology. A new report by City Research states, and this is the key, City is telling us that they are all in. They are retooling and redoing their factories, not for the past, but for the future. And they're using the technology of the future to compete in today. And that's one of the reasons when we start talking about the production, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, the production of EVs. When we start talking about these things, the reason that there's a competitive advantage, the reason that as the tech sector of China grows, and there will be a need for more and more protectionism in the West, unless the West can innovate. Not through tariffs and all these other schemes and shenanigans, but really and truly innovate, retool, stop all of the nonsense, the infighting, the bickering. They're not having all that infighting and bickering in China. They know where they're going and they're trying to get there. I want to thank you for watching the program. We've got so much to cover for you today. I just want to ask that you drop a comment in the comment section, that you give us a like, and that you follow the program so that we can grow the channel. China eyes robot manufacturing as a way to fuel economic growth. You know, many of the the developed countries in the world are facing demographic issues. Many of them are facing aging populations and diminished child birth rates. And China is no different. China has significant issues in its demography, in its demographic sector. However, they're looking at these technologies as a way to help continue to fuel the robotics, continue to fuel their industrial capacity in the face of the demographic challenges. One of the definitions of high quality development proposed by the Chinese government is the continuous improvement of efficiency. And in the era of digitalization and intelligence, the improvement of productivity and efficiency is undoubtedly driven by automation. In the process of embracing automation, more and more companies in China have turned their attention to collaborative robots. And that's one of the things I wanted to put up, is because I think sometimes when we think about robotics, we think about the factories that are fully robotic. But the large move towards robots is not the robots completely and totally replacing human beings. It's the connection between robots and humans that make for a high precision, high productivity factories. An industrial sector that is both robotic, meaning that it has savings, it has efficiency, but is also human, meaning that it has dexterity, it has the ability to handle intricate tasks and to observe and to think through complex patterns on the fly, on the site. And that's something that requires the training, not only the creation of robotics, the creation of AI, but it also requires the training of people. And in the West, in the United States, in the UK, in countries, France and Italy and Germany, are they training the next generation to be productive and to operate in these spaces? See, it's not just about creating the machines. If robots aren't fully replacing humans, then not only will you have to create the robots, but you will have to train a population who is able to work in these factories using new technology, using the robots as aids. And this will help not only with the productivity and the efficiency, but it will help to solve the demographic problem as it pertains to the economic output and the growth of the economy. that China is facing. What is the West answer to the aging population and the declining? It cannot be the opening of borders. That's what we're seeing is they're dealing with, while not telling the public, but it's truly clear to me that the issue in the West of demography is being handled by a poor attempt, a veiled attempt at controlling borders, when in actuality they're allowing, through mismanagement, through, they're fighting in public and putting on a good song and dance. But I think the business sector is clear. They want workers, younger workers, and if they're not being produced in the West, they're going to cripple the political systems to allow individuals to come in from outside and to fill that void. Now, you can make an argument that that's good for these individuals who's coming in. You can make an argument that in these countries whose political systems have been wrecked partially by Western intervention and exploitation, how is it that they can then turn around and deny access to people who are fleeing the chaos that they've made? But you have to look at it in one more way. What about the people who live in these countries who now find themselves not able to earn a living wage? What about the people who have mortgages and homes and other things that they're trying to sustain? What happens in those countries? And we're going to do a deep dive here in another couple of episodes just about the immigration crisis that's going on and how the global South and how the West are dealing with these issues differently. Let's talk about it. Artificial intelligence. This is another reason why China may win the tech war. And it's conceivable to hold that position. I mean, that's not a far-fetched position to have, that China could emerge as the global technology leader, even with and partially because of the sanctions and embargoes, helping to create artificial markets. China is investing heavily year over year in the development of AI. This is one of the sectors where China is behind, and partially due to the availability of the necessary chips to fuel AI, but partially due to the fact that the embargoes and other things initially had some impact. But long term, I don't know, with this type of investment, with the type of maneuvering and the collapse of the effectiveness of embargoes, sanctions, and tariffs, how you can hold back China. Look what the Harvard Gazette says, why China has edge on AI. What ancient emperors tell us about Xi Jinping. One of the things we have to be mindful is that there's something cultural about AI. There's a fear that exists in the West about the deployment of technology, artificial intelligence. The notion in the West, and I think it's a good notion, about privacy. I'm all for privacy. That doesn't exist in the same way in China. This notion of privacy is not a part of their ethos. And as a result, the deployment of technology happens much more rapidly in spaces where you're not hampered by the morality and the issues of privacy. Facial recognition all over China, observation and tracking of individuals. On the one hand, for me personally, it's a bad thing to have so much invasion in our personal lives. But on the other hand, from the Chinese perspective, it allows the government to achieve their goals, but also it's the deployment of the technology. And that's what specifically I'm interested in our discussion today. The deployment of the technology in and of itself creates opportunity for innovation. It's hard to innovate something until you put it in the field. But the moment you put it in the field, you'll see pros and cons. You'll see what's working, what's not. You'll come up with new ideas. And China's willingness to deploy AI, to put the AI in the field so that it can be used in and of itself, will lead to greater innovation. Whereas in the West, if we are hesitant about deploying it in factories, in commercial, and in home use and in residential use, ultimately we will stifle the industry and find ourselves not creating the type of new products and innovating in a way that enables us to have a strategic advantage. Their deployment of this technology is going to give them a strategic advantage. Now let's move to what the European and some of the other countries are afraid of. And I even think the United States is afraid of this global push by China for electric vehicles. China's automakers take the world by storm with the electric vehicle push. You know, there was a time when Japan rose up in the automaking industry, in the automaking sector, and caught America by surprise. That it put Detroit being the central location where the automakers were hubbed and many of their factories were located. It shocked them, it took them by storm. Now we see that there's another shock to the system in the automaker sector, and it's China with EVs. And it's alarming. It's clear, this is from CNN Business, it's clear that they are very competitive in the electric car value chain, meaning that what you're getting and what you're paying for it's a value in what you're getting. You're not your money, you're getting big bang for your bucks when you spend it with these automakers in China who are making EVs. I think they are a generation ahead of us. That's what the automaker sector here in America is saying. Chinese electric cars, cheaper than models built elsewhere, are making inroads in Europe, Australia, and Southeast Asia. Competitors worry that Chinese brands may eventually dominate the global EV market. If EVs were the wave of the future, and we see that there's all of this movement towards electric vehicles. They're putting charging stations everywhere. Hybrid vehicles was a move. Now we're going fully electric. And if that's the wave of the future, China is already a generation ahead. They have the ability to significantly grab market share if we're going to play the game fair. But what we see is, once again, when there's losses in the West, there's this cry for tariffs and protectionism. When the West is behind, instead of the West trying to catch up, instead of countries who find themselves at adverse conditions innovating, it's a push towards, can I go to the government and get, we oftentimes in the United States, there was this notion of welfare queens. Individuals who are living off of the government, whose very existence was provided by the government. I think more dangerous to the system is not poor people trying to get resources from the government. I think it's corporate welfare. Corporate welfare is far more costly. It's costly in the monies that are lost, but it's costly also in the stifling of innovation and development. When there's free competition, those who succeed are rewarded, and those who are failing are not propped up, because when you prop up failing companies, what you'll find is there are systematic issues within those countries, and you'll continue to prop them up. Look at the automaker sector. Yes, the automaker sector was bailed out during the Great Recession. Now they find themselves with a new crisis. Are we going to bail them out again? The banks were bailed out during the Great Recession. Instead of them having to innovate and to redo their models, the bailouts enabled them to continue roughly business as usual. Yes, they put in Dodd-Frank, but ultimately it went back to business as usual. Now we're seeing another round of bailouts by the Fed. And that's what happens when you engage in protectionism. Your industries don't get the opportunity to grow naturally, and you find yourself in a cycle of bailouts. How China's car companies built so wide a lead in the race to make EVs. I'm telling you right now, if you live in the United States, if you live in one of the G7 countries, you will be subsidizing, you will be doing bailouts for the automakers. It's coming. It has happened multiple times before, and because of what's going on in China now, they are going to be receiving huge benefits from the government at the taxpayers' expense. And for me, it seems all the time that the losses are made public, but the gains are all private, meaning that when things go bad in these corporations, they get a bailout, which we, the public, pay for. And then when things go good, all of that money goes to the capitalists and the owners of these corporations. And it's coming again because they're so far behind in order to be competitive. And the consumer is not going to want to buy cars, EVs. Go to a car lot, see what the EVs cost. They are astronomically high for a technology that the infrastructure is not yet quite ready for. How can you ask someone to pay? And this is just me personally. I know a lot of people have Teslas and they love Teslas, but can you pay $100,000, $120,000, $130,000 for a vehicle? And the difficulty in driving that vehicle across country or any long trip, you're sitting at a car charging stations, and the difficulty in getting the vehicle serviced and other issues associated with it. The infrastructure in the West has to improve, and the cost of these EVs has to decline. Just because you can charge something for a product doesn't mean you do so, because when you do that, you create a space for competition. And that's essentially what has happened. They thought they had such an advantage, and they thought they had a captive market. They began to charge outrageous prices, and that allowed China to move in with their industrial robotics, to move in with their factories and efficiency, and produce a product that is equal or better at a lower price. And so now it's caught the Western car makers. They're stuck. They're trying to figure out, now, how do we catch up? What do we do now? They've got cars sitting on lots that they can't move, and now they're telling the government, hey, we need you to rig the game for us. That's not a sign that you're winning the tech war. That's a sign you're losing the tech war. When you're going to the government, asking the government to rig, to ban, embargo, to sanction, that's a sign that you are admitting your failure and that you've already lost. How China's EV boom caught Western car companies asleep at the wheel. They were raking in profits with captive audiences, selling products that were exorbitant in price, and we're getting away with it. And as long as you can get away with something, you keep doing it. And the moment you can't, instead of changing trajectory, what they decided to do is to ask the governments to rig the system. And this is the same thing that happened when the Japanese automakers caught the West by surprise, caught the U.S., the Detroit by surprise. This is the same thing happened. We're seeing the same patterns over and over again. And that's why I say bailouts are coming. Incentives are coming. They're getting ready to be pouring taxpayer dollars into these companies. And these companies will become profitable again. They will catch up. I'm not saying they're going to go under. The United States will not allow, no country will allow their automaking sector to go under, because it becomes strategic. This is part of the national defense infrastructure of a nation. But the problem is, when they were making money, that was all theirs. When they falter, the onus of bailing them out will be the general public. Look at this. And the final thing I wanted to talk about is this, number 5. Striking back. Do you think China is going to sit idle and let you try to rig the game against them so that you can deflate their economy and artificially prop up yours, that they're not going to respond? That's the real weird thing about the West. They sometimes in Western countries, I don't know whether it's hubris, I don't know what it is, but it's this notion that we can do to you, but then we're shocked at what the responses are going to be. They put these embargoes and all of this stuff to kind of rig the system, to contain, to divert resources away, and the ability to gain resources by China away from its economy. But what did you think China was going to do? Just sit idle and allow your chip makers and other companies to just run wild? No, China struck back, and in 3 ways. First, China's antitrust authority has effectively blocked any and all corporate mergers involving a U.S. semiconductor company that operates in Chinese markets. And while this may seem like a minor thing, but to operate in China, you have to do so in cooperation oftentimes with local companies. And by blocking these mergers and blocking this connection, what you're doing is preventing them from gaining technology. You're preventing them from operating in other sectors in the technology arena within China. And once again, it's hurting specific companies who do business in that space in China. The second thing, China initiated a cybersecurity review of Micron. You know, all of this stuff about banning certain companies, Huawei, and they can do the same thing. And essentially what they've done is announced a similar measure that the U.S. did and began to ban specific companies from selling products to the government and public sector in China. And these were significant customers for these companies. So in trying to create protectionism in one place, you spark protectionism somewhere else, and ultimately now you're creating artificial markets. Now you're enabling local companies, and I think it's best for China than it is for America. You're sparking the development of technology in China and forcing them to innovate. And sometimes we don't innovate if we have low cost, high quality goods, which is what was happening before. But now you're doing this tit for tat. But on one hand, you had the market sewn up. America had the chip market and other markets sewn up. But now by forcing them to create their own, you're hurting yourself, your own companies. And you're creating spaces where now customers are being created for Chinese chip companies that didn't exist before because those companies wanted low cost, high quality chips from the West. The third thing is this. In order to do some of the computing that is necessary, certain minerals, certain elements are necessary for the sector. Third, China has announced the exports of gallium and germanium, two minerals that are important raw inputs for electronics manufacturing are now subject to export license requirements. In other words, you may stop us from getting chips, but we can take away the minerals necessary for these electronic components, the minerals necessary that you need for the development of your technology sector. So there's this tit for tat that's going on. And while on one hand, the United